so, I pretty much exclusively did third speeches, and I grew to really, really like them. So I want to share with you some things that I ended up learning along the way as I was doing thirds. Some of what I'll cover are things that I learned from my coaches on the team, Jason and Brent, so credit is due there. Some will be the especially useful tips that I picked up on. Some of what I'll cover are... Oh, looks like there was a little bit of an echo there. Some of it will be things I picked up on in feedback after tournament rounds from some of the top university debaters in the world. And some will just be things that I kind of picked up along the way by messing around and trying out new approaches. So the title of this seminar is going to be Strategy in Thirds, Prep Time, Prioritization During the Round, and Style. And the goal is to basically look at a bunch of different things that a third speaker needs to do, all through the lens of strategy. It's going to be intentionally broad in what I'm going to cover. I'm going to try to get through a lot of material. So hopefully every person watching can take away at least one thing that'll be useful to them. A few quick preliminary disclaimers before we get started. First of all, this is a workshop for thirds, but I think much of it will be transferable to second speakers and replies. So even if you're not a third, if you're in the audience, it could still be useful to stick around. Second, this is intended as a seminar sort of on intermediate to advanced strategy. My assumption is that people are comfortable with the basics of refutation, rebuilding, the general structure of thirds. I think this seminar will be particularly helpful to people who meet that description. But if that's not you, there'll still be some parts that I think will be helpful. Finally, I've been asked to leave Q&A at the end, just to not disrupt the recording and whatnot. So I'll try to keep this within 30, 40 minutes, and then we can get to Q&A. All right, I'm going to start with a quick overview. What exactly is strategy? One thing I was told that I thought was especially insightful after a round about a year and a half ago is that a judge told me that strategy is all about resource allocation. And so I reflected on that and thought about what that means and how it applies to the different elements of debate. And I came to view strategy in the following way. It's about how we are allocating our thinking time during prep, so what we are actually deciding to focus on. It's about how we're allocating our thinking and note-taking time in the round. So as we're listening to other speakers, what are we jotting down on our sheet? What responses are we thinking of? Where do we anticipate the round going? It's about how we allocate our speaking time during our speech. So how many minutes are we allocating to the different themes? And it's also about how we're allocating our arguments. How are we moving around the different content that we have in order to fit into our strategic vision and interact successfully with the other content that is on the floor? So throughout the seminar, I'm going to want to kind of look at how those broad themes of strategy apply in the different stages of a third speech. First, we're going to talk about prep time, then strategy during the round, and then we'll talk a little bit about execution and style. All right, prep time. So you're in prep, you're making the case with your teammates, and then you have some time to yourself. Probably in most variations of the way people do prep, there's a little bit of thinking time that a third speaker has to themselves. So how are you using that time? I would emphasize two main principles that I think would be worth focusing on: anticipation and flexibility. So anticipating your opponent's arguments, but remaining flexible enough to deviate from your planned strategy and from your preparation in order to be adaptable during the round. Obviously, it's very difficult to strike the balance here because if you over-prepare, you over-anticipate, you're going to lack flexibility. And if you focus too much on flexibility, you won't be prepared enough. So here's a little bit of guidance on how I think you can go about both anticipation and flexibility. Beginning with anticipation. The overarching principle here is to have a strong sense of what the other side is going to say and have a fair amount of rebuttal prepared such that during the round, you have extra time to do higher level strategic thinking. So you don't need to waste time thinking of the core responses. Hopefully you have some of those core responses in mind. And then during the round, when the stakes are high, when things are coming at you that you didn't expect, when the round is shifting strategically, you can do higher level thinking. In order to do that kind of preparation, I would recommend some combination of a three-part approach. And it's worth noting, this is pretty close to what I did. I know some other debaters who did it, but a lot of debaters don't do this. There's a ton of different ways of note-taking in prep. of preparing for the round, of anticipating, of adapting. So take it with a grain of salt. But here's my recommended 3-part approach. The first and most basic element is to have core responses to the main, 2 to 3 arguments you anticipate from the other side. You might have more than one response to each argument, in which case I would also recommend, having some kind of visual way to prioritize those responses according to how important you think they are. So, maybe a star or a circle around the more important ones. You might want to highlight them, something like that, just so that during the round, when you want to be flexible, when you might have to cut some responses due to time constraints, you'll know which ones to prioritize. Second part to this approach is to have a sense of your themes. There's obviously a couple of different ways to do themes. You can make it so that each theme is its own path to winning the round. So, why we win on what's best for the individual, what's best for society, or economic benefits, political effects, whatever it is. Alternatively, the themes can, as a whole, contribute to some broader way you're winning the round. So maybe a theme will involve you mitigating an argument of theirs or proving that a principle they forwarded doesn't necessarily apply in the round, and therefore we should default to theme number 2 in the speech. Either way, that'll probably be round dependent, but it's good to have an idea of your themes because I think the very process of thinking that through helps you think through the strategy that you're probably going to want to emphasize in the third speech. The third part of the approach, which I think is optional and probably the most difficult one to do, but one that I thought was very useful to me, is to prepare ideas that you think will be helpful to you based on the unique context of the round. And this is going to be very round dependent as well. But what I would do is I would think about where the evolution of the clash is likely to go. So when the most sophisticated version of both cases is going to emerge after, say, second prop, second op, what do I think the clash is going to come down to? And then on a separate sheet, you can prepare analysis that you think will be useful in that context. Even if you don't actually do that, this I think is a useful exercise of deepening your case, is just to think about where the strongest version of both sides is going to go. I'll give you a couple of examples here. Firstly, let's say the motion is this House would nationalize the pharmaceutical industry. So nationalize the pharmaceutical industry. You see this motion come out when they announce the motion, and you should immediately make note of the fact that this is a round about taking some radical measure to improve a broken system. There are lots of motions with that format. Radical measure to improve broken system. In any round, almost any round, that's about taking radical measure to improve a broken system, the op is probably going to countermodel. It's just very likely because in all likelihood, there is some problem with the status quo, and that's why the CA team set the motion. Then you're going to have reasons why their countermodel doesn't work. Their regulations are impractical, too costly, people won't support them enough, whatever it is. But you also want to win, even in the instance that the countermodel does apply. So what I would do, and maybe this is something that you'd find useful in prep, is to have a new sheet where you'd assume that their regulation countermodel applies and explain why our solution is still superior. So you prepare a couple of reasons why our case, even in its fully mitigated form by their countermodel, is still a winning case. And you'll note that this is not really something that fits anywhere into your arguments necessarily. It's a little bit too preemptive for the first proposition speaker to go into any detail on this, which is why these are the types of things that you might not necessarily think through in prep unless you're being methodical about anticipating where the strongest version of the other side is going. Another example, this House regrets the glorification of hard work. This House regrets the glorification of hard work. So this one falls into a different category of motions. It falls into the category of abstract debates about very vague concepts, which is a hint that much of the debate will be about characterization, but clarifying and describing what these vague concepts like glorification and hard work actually mean. So if I'm on the proposition team, I might be making arguments about people's well-being, how they're let down when they fail because they blame themselves for not working hard enough. I might make an argument about how this sort of feeds into the pernicious idea that if poor people just worked harder, they can make it, which leads to ignoring structural barriers. Opposition is probably going to respond by saying the glorification of hard work simply makes people work harder, and that's a good thing. It glorifies the process and not necessarily the end game. And eventually, this characterization clash is going to come down to what the glorification of hard work actually means and what it looks like. Does it indirectly glorify the outcomes of hard work, such that all the prop harms apply because people will blame themselves when they don't achieve those outcomes? Or does it glorify the process of hard work as valuable in itself, regardless of the outcomes? So realizing that that is where this clash might go. In prep, I might make a new sheet where I think about reasons why our characterization is true, why the glorification of hard work tends to map onto these notions of like successful outcomes, broadly defined, or like capitalistic notions of success, which is basically a deeper version of what your first speaker might be presenting. But what I'm trying to get at is there are lots of things that just won't fit in the case necessarily because the first speaker is going to have time constraints. They can't preempt everything that's going to come from the other side. So having some basic awareness of where the case is going and the analysis that you'll need once the case is fully evolved, I think is a super useful thing to have for thirds, especially because the third speech is really like where the maximal depth of both cases is arising and where you're expected to deal with the most evolved case from the other side. So that's anticipation. It comes with time. I think it's a difficult skill, but I genuinely do believe that you can do some version of this at any level because you can always push yourself to think one step deeper than your opponents about how the round is going to play out. And if you can do that, you're always going to be a leg up because you're always going to be one step ahead of what's coming. One quick caveat is to be very cautious about not going too far down an imaginary clash that you're predicting in prep, because you might not be predicting everything correctly. So this is a very fine balancing act of knowing how much you need to predict and how much you want to prepare without wasting time on things that might not arise because your opponents aren't going to bring them up. So you want to be focusing on dealing with things that you expect are likely to come from the other side and that are strong coming from the other side, because there's no real reason to predict super weak claims, because if they're very weak, chances are you'll be able to deal with them on the fly. You want to be able to spend your alone time in prep or with a teammate thinking about the things that are going to be most challenging for you to respond to. So that's how I prioritize those thinking minutes. Second broad principle, like I said before, is going to be flexibility. There's not much to say here other than be ready to scrap tons of responses if you just didn't predict the case right. I think that requires a lot of discipline. Like you might have prepared the best responses you've ever prepped, but you have to be ready to ditch them if they just end up don't being valuable. Like there have been tons of times where I prepared like what I thought was really good rebuttal, and then the other side didn't run the case I expected, and then I found some way to sneak in the rebuttal anyway because I wanted to say it, and it looked completely useless. So don't do what I did. Have discipline, be able to scrap responses if they're not necessary, if they're not contributing to the round as it's playing out. So that's the prep room. Let's talk now about strategy in the round itself. After the prep room, the next period is between minute 60 of prep and minute 1 of your speech. So what are you doing during that time? Here's like a broad overview, because for me, when I started giving thirds, I had no idea, like at what point am I supposed to have my themes? At what point am I supposed to have like a clearly structured speech? So here's a template. If you're a third prop, let's start with that. If you're third prop, during the first proposition speech, I would recommend continuing to work on maybe prepared ref a little bit. I would recommend listening very carefully to your first speaker, figure out what they're emphasizing, what they might be missing or not talking about enough, what might be coming out a little bit less clearly than usual from your speech that you might have to spend time clarifying, and listening very, very carefully for POIs, because you want to know, okay, where's this opposition team going in the next speech? During the first opposition speech, you probably want to be tracking the detail of their speech very, very carefully, because this is where the bulk of the op content is coming out. And the third prop speaker is a responsive speaker, so you need to be ready to deal with that detail. Here's where you can be tracking their speech, refining your responses based on the nuance that you didn't anticipate when you were preparing rebuttal, and adding responses to the entirely new ideas that you didn't anticipate at all. Then we get to second prop. Second prop is a busy speech for the third prop speaker, because I think it's where you're working rapidly on piecing together responses, rebuilding your themes. This is where the speech really starts to take shape. Ideally, and this is one tip that I want to highlight as being particularly important, is to listen very carefully to your partner at the same time as you're prepping, as you're like note taking, which is very difficult to do. It took me forever to be able to do this like even decently. And even then towards late in my debating, I thought it was very hard. But it's very important to listen to your partner because if only because it can be a huge time saver. There are a variety of reasons why it's important. But one is that it'll help you save a ton of time in your speech. Because sometimes second prop will have such a good response and second op will just drop it. They'll miss that response. In third prop, you don't need to go into huge detail about that response again. You can flag the lack of response from second op. You can briefly summarize what the second prop speaker said. You can say something about how it's too late for third opposition to respond. You can make the judge feel really bad about crediting an op block response later on. And then you can say, here's why this was terrible for their case. Here's why it wins us the round. So that's a big time saver if you're able to listen very carefully while your partners are speaking. By the end of the second prop speech, you probably want to be done most of what you had to do, except respond to second op. And then during the second op speech, you probably leave space on your sheet to engage with them and catch up on the things that you didn't quite finish. So, finalize your introduction if necessary, add nuance to your weighing, refine some of your responses, etc. That's sort of my broad template for third props. Give or take, you can go a little bit later if you trust yourself in being quick towards the end. You can go a little bit earlier if you find that, you need to be a little bit prepared in advance. You don't like to be rushed towards the end. That works too. For third op, I think the process is largely the same. It's just instead of finishing most of what you have to do before second op, you want to finish most of what you do before third prop, and then just have time to listen to what third prop has to say. Another key tip here, though, is that all throughout those speeches, I would recommend trying to think as though you're a judge. Think about what issues you're winning on, what issues you're losing on, which side is winning. Think about which issues can you afford to lose while still winning the round, and which issues you need to win if you're going to end up winning the round. I think that helps gauge what's going to be important. And it also helps you allocate time, not just during your speech, but also your thinking time during the round. Because ultimately, there's just a finite amount of time you have and a finite amount of things that you can actually focus on at any given point. So knowing sort of what's important, where you need to win, where you can afford to lose, can guide the types of things you're going to spend time on. For instance, there might be a really dangerous argument coming from the other side that might completely destroy whatever plan you had to win the round. You'll probably want to spend more time thinking about how to respond to that. And you can even ask your first or second speaker who isn't giving the reply to help think of responses as well. So basically, the strategic awareness of where you are in the round is a big time saver because it helps you allocate your thinking time as well. All right, so that's sort of minute 60 of prep up until minute 1, minute 0 of your speech. Next question, obviously, is what are you actually doing during your speech? So the third speech at a minimum should have a pretty clear strategy to win the round. It should attempt to mitigate the issues the other side is winning on, amplify the importance of what you're winning on, increase your margins of victory, and decrease theirs. Aside from like the basic responses and rebuilding that go into that, there are 3 things I want to touch on about like features of thirds that play into those strategic decisions. The first is just the number and the order of responses. A lot of people ask, how many responses should I give? What order should I put them in, etc. I would say to do what is sufficient, but nothing more than necessary. In other words, I find a lot of debaters, like the traditional trajectory, I think, for a debater, and this was sort of true of me, you start out having no idea what you're doing. Then you get a lot better and you think, oh, look, I can think of all these things. Isn't this cool? And you start to give 5, 6 responses to arguments. And then once you get to a higher level, you realize those 5, 6 responses aren't really necessary. And that in reality, if you're giving that many responses, with some exceptions, they're probably not going to be as deep as you'd really want them to. So I would say there's no need to pile on a ton of responses. Do what you think is enough to defeat their argument and then move on. In terms of how to order responses, so let's say there's an argument, you have a number of responses to that argument. I used to struggle with like which one's coming first, which one's coming second, etc. I like to do it in sort of ascending order of how charitable you're being to the other side. So you give your first most direct response that takes down their claim, granting them none of their assumptions. But then you grant them progressively more of their assumptions and beat their argument anyway. So, even if they're right in assuming X, we still beat this argument for these reasons. One thing that I used to do, which I don't think is good, is to start out by granting all those assumptions, sort of making their argument as good as it is, or even better than it actually is, and then trying to respond, which is just creating more work for yourself. You should give the direct response first. That's not straw manning the argument. It's not making it worse than it is, but it's dealing with it as it's presented. And then you get progressively into granting them more of their assumptions. So that's on the number and the order of responses. Second, on weighing. I'm not going to get too much into weighing because I think there are lots of seminars online that have done a far better job than I could do about this. But I will mention a few things that I think are useful. The importance of weighing is just to give judges a reason to care about something more than something else. Because the biggest fear of a debater is the judge deciding for themselves. You don't want the judge to decide for themselves what they care about. You want to tell them what to care about. When you're weighing in that way, there are a couple of major weighing axes. One is just plausibility. How believable is your argument? Your argument's more believable than theirs. The second is importance. So which goal is more important to achieve? You could do this through a number of weighing metrics, like our policy has a deeper effect, an effect of greater magnitude on people. It affects a wider scope of people. It affects an actor to whom we have a particular moral obligation, etc. You could arguably slide in another weighing axis about uniqueness or exclusivity, like whether your policy is the only way of achieving the outcome you're talking about. But I'm going to leave that aside for now. What I want to talk about is being aware of how weighing metrics intersect with one another. And this is kind of hard to explain without an example. So I'm going to take an example that makes this probably more clear than any other example there could be, which is the motion, this House regrets the invention of nuclear weapons. So we're debating about whether, the existence of nuclear weapons, their invention was a good thing. Unsurprisingly, prop is regretting the invention. They're probably going to say something about nuclear war or a catastrophe. They can make other arguments, but that's probably going to come up. Prop is going to say someone might use nukes. Nukes are bad. Pretty obvious. Op will say, nuclear war is unlikely. There's mutually assured destruction. You're going to nuke someone. They're going to nuke you back. No one nukes each other. And nukes have a variety of other advantages, including, deterring smaller scale warfare, that kind of thing. So where we're at is basically prop has an improbable but gigantic impact, and op has a more likely but smaller impact. So on either side, you want to make both axes, the probability and the importance, more favorable to you. And you want to ask yourself, which of these do I actually need to spend more time thinking about? And sometimes it's the one that you're less intuitively winning on. So on prop, it's pretty intuitive that nuclear war is going to be devastating. I really think you can get away with explaining this fairly quickly. It doesn't have to be a big focus of your speech. If you prove that nukes might be used, that's a pretty clear way of winning the round and a pretty clear imperative and reason to regret their invention. So you can explain it pretty quickly. And then where you're going to want to focus your time is giving reasons why the use of nukes might be more likely than one might think. So, not all countries have nuclear weapons. So the concept of mutually assured destruction doesn't always work. Countries have different nuclear capabilities. So there are often imbalances between countries, which means that the deterrence doesn't always work. You might have ideologically driven regimes that get their hands on nukes. You might just have accidents in, highly intense wartime scenarios where you poorly predict what the other side is intending. Regardless, the point here is just to be aware of what's going to be contentious. And if you have an intuitively gigantic impact, you probably want to explain that, but then you want to spend more time explaining the plausibility of it and why it's not something that's so improbable that it can just be washed away. And the inverse is true on the other side. So just having this sort of awareness on an almost abstract level of where are you winning, where are you more intuitive on these different weighing dimensions, and which ones need to spend more time on. So that's weighing. But there's a lot more to say about weighing, and there are other places to find it. So third thing then under strategy during your speech is the order and prioritization of themes. This is something that I always had questions about, and I didn't know like which theme should come first. Is it about importance? Is it about what I'm winning on, what I'm losing on? Here's a couple things that were useful to me, and that I also learned quite heavily from my coaches, Jason and Brent, as well. One is that if you have a tendency to spend too much time on the first theme, I'd recommend putting your most important theme first. Like if you're getting to the final of a big tournament, and throughout the tournament, you've consistently been spending 6 minutes on your first theme, then like a minute and a half on your second theme and 30 seconds on your third theme, chances are you're not going to fix that in the highest stakes round you've been in. So recognize the time management issues that you have. And if you do have them, put the most important thing first. Other than that, there's no hard and fast rule. But here are some guidelines that were pretty useful to me. First thing I would think of is if you have an issue that you're winning on and you want to clear it up and weigh it against the other issues, you can start with that. That is the case if you think that issue is round winning, right? So you can start with something, you can be losing on other material, but you can delay responding to it directly because you think there's one crucial theme that you're winning on that you can just blow up and outweigh everything else with. Alternatively, if you think you're losing on a critical issue, on a critical theme, and you can't win the round without first hedging against the super big impact that the second off speaker claim they're getting or whatever it is, you might want to start with that because otherwise it just sounds like you're losing until like minute 5 of your speech. Finally, one small trick. I didn't do this. I don't think this comes up too frequently, but it can often be very, very useful, is regarding third arguments. There's kind of like this trend in debate where like no one really cares about third arguments. You make them because you want to satisfy the rules, and then everyone drops them. No one pays attention to them. They don't come up in the RFD, etc. But sometimes they can be very useful. So let's say you're a third opposition speaker and you had a third argument in second op. That third prop completely did not respond to, which happens very often because I think debaters, including myself, tend to think third arguments are often just going to be less important. So there are a ton of times that I've both done myself and seen other third speakers just not respond to the third argument coming from the other side, which is not something good to do. I'm not recommending that, but it is something that happens. In that scenario, if you're the third op speaker, it can be super effective if it's a good argument to just start with that third argument and the theme around it, point out the other side didn't respond very briefly, hype up the importance of that argument, make the judge feel like it would be super unfair to credit a response in prop reply, and then claim that the argument is round winning. Obviously, the argument needs to be round winning for this to be the case, but this is, I think, an overlooked strategy that can be very effective. The broad takeaway, though, in terms of prioritization of themes, is to always be flexible and willing to adapt and shift your themes around, I think up until very close before the end of your speech. Because frankly, oftentimes it's the case that the second speakers on the team are going to be very strong strategically. Like I think a lot of teams will put their strategically strongest speaker second, and there might be complete pivots strategically, or there might be, even if it's not a pivot, it's like a very direct, explicit strategic move that the second speaker might be making right before you. And I think that calls for flexibility and adaptability because the strategy coming out might be very different than what you had expected or what you'd prepared for. So having that flexibility, being willing to shift around your themes could be important. All right, that is strategy in the round. Final thing of this seminar is going to be execution and style. Style in thirds is, I think, not immediately intuitive because, like, fundamentally, the way we think of thirds is as an analytical rebuttal speech. But I strongly believe that the best third speakers are also able to master style and to complement those analytical portions of their speech. And nowadays, it's rare that a third speech is a strictly a style speech, right? They're increasingly analytically dense, and that's sort of the terrain that we're dealing with. So in light of that, how can we integrate style in some capacity without undermining the density analytically of the speeches, just to make them more persuasive and more memorable? I'll give you some examples of people who've done it in a second. I think the bare minimum is to use style for strategic emphasis. There are lots of debaters who didn't think of themselves as stylistic debaters, who didn't think of themselves as necessarily, the most rhetorically persuasive. But most good thirds, and often excellent thirds, will at the very least use style to emphasize what's important. So these kinds of speeches are still fundamentally an analysis speech, but there's a use of style to highlight what is important, which is crucial because you need to tell a judge when they should be listening to you more carefully instead of zoning out. Or even if they're not zoning out, they might be thinking of other things. They might be thinking through their RFD, who's winning, who's losing. So how do you tell a judge to listen, or to listen particularly carefully, or to treat something with importance without actually saying that to them? The first most direct way is to say something like, underline this, panel, or, and this is crucial, something like that before you introduce an idea. You don't want to overuse that strategy because it can be pretty annoying to literally tell the judge, circle this on your notes as you're listening to me say it. But it's the minimum way of accomplishing what you're going to do. The second, and I think more interesting way, is variation in tone and in speed. And one thing to clarify here is that there's no particular tone or speed that's good. It's not inherently good to speak slow, or speak quick, speak loud, speak quietly. But it's the deviation that ends up mattering. So you're talking, and then suddenly you pause, you get slower, you enunciate more clearly, and that cues the attention of the judge to what you're saying. So it's those deviations that end up matter. You can get louder, you can even get faster, or you can get slower, but it's the changes that signal the importance to what you're saying. Quick caveat here is that overusing these stylistic cues defeats their very purpose, right? If you're constantly saying, and this is super important, and this is round winning, a judge won't buy it because the importance that you can attribute to something is sort of proportional to how infrequently you're referring to something as important, right? If you're calling everything important, then nothing's important. So you want to keep it for the special moments in your speech, the moments that you really want the judge to remember. The second and more stylistic form of speech. So we did the minimum. The minimum is, you're a great analytical speaker, but you're signaling where you think the judge should pay attention. And you might, highlight parts of your paper where you want to say, and this is crucial, or where you want to slow down or change your tone or change your emphasis. The second and more stylistic speech is one that incorporates noteworthy stylistic moments. So it's a third speech that is genuinely a joy to listen to. These are speeches that integrate powerful rhetoric, humor, even metaphors or other literary techniques, imagery, sparingly, because it's still fundamentally an analytical speech and you have a lot of material to deal with. But it has those moments. It has memorable moments. So it's the type of speech that is great analytically, but that a non-debater would also appreciate as being, extremely persuasive as well. This can't really be taught. There are some tips that can be given, but I think one thing that can be super useful is to learn from debaters who've done it well. So here are a few debaters who I think have sort of set the gold standard for achieving this balance of brilliant analysis and also special rhetorical moments that really make the judge want to vote for you. Tejas, so third speaker from Team India 2019, is a phenomenal example. Kate, third speaker from Team South Africa in 2015. RJ, the third speaker from Team Singapore 2011-2012. These are all debaters who I think mastered analysis, but also had very, very strong stylistic moments in their speeches that made them memorable. And unsurprisingly, all top speakers at WSDC. So obviously this requires, I think, a little bit of natural talent that some incredible third speakers have had. But to try to get to that standard, I think what can be useful is to try out new stylistic moves in practice rounds that are, low stakes rounds. You're capable, you're comfortable messing up, embarrassing yourself a little. The other thing is to, watch great stylistic speakers. So I'd recommend watching those three and a bunch of others that you can find on YouTube, and sort of figure out what your unique style is. Learning from them, but not emulating them. Figuring out what they've done right. And finding kind of where your stylistic bend really is. The final thing I'd say is don't be afraid to, if you're a brief note taker, don't be afraid to write down a couple of full sentences that you think are going to sound particularly persuasive. So if you want to go for those strong stylistic moments in your speech that are the most memorable moments, that kind of you're aiming to meet the standards set out by some of those speakers I was talking about, there's no reason to be afraid of actually taking the time to write down a couple of sentences, or at least the ideas behind those sentences, if you don't want to mess up their presentation and you want to get them really, really down pat. So that's a bit of a note on style. Very hard to teach style. Very hard to even figure it out. Something that I struggled with until the end and that I focused on improving at. But I do think it's a lot of experimentation and a lot of watching from the people who've done it best. Okay, that wraps up what I've got. In terms of just, taking some of the material from this workshop and moving forward, hopefully this was appropriate to like the level that debaters are at. Hopefully it wasn't too basic or too difficult. What I'd say is if this felt like a lot and it was super broad and there was a ton of different stuff being thrown at you, try not to get overwhelmed and probably focus on one thing at a time. That's something that was useful to me, was thinking, what are the 2 to 3 things that I want to do in this next speech that I have that I want to improve at? And then after the round, reflecting on how did those 2 to 3 things go? Did they go better than the round before? Just to make the steps towards improvement a little bit more manageable and less daunting. All right, that's what I've got. Thanks, everyone. I hope this was useful in some way. And we'll do a Q&A now if anyone has any.
Cool. Thank you so much. And I hope this was useful to everyone. Diego, for sure, go.
Yeah, thank you first of all. And I also wanted to ask how do you recommend we structure each theme, like the structure of the theme itself? Like, do you always try to follow a certain structure? I know that, of course, it's always going to depend on the round, but if you could give us like some tips on that, that would be amazing.
Yeah, of course. Great question. I think it is round dependent to an extent. There's one template that a lot of speakers will swear by and do very frequently, which is their argument, response 1, response 2, or however many, response 3. Even if their argument is true, this is response 3. Our argument is more important. And then you transition to rebuilding. So, you start with their argument, you give your responses. One of your responses is effectively a weighing response against your argument, which helps you transition naturally into rebuilding. And then you can end the theme with, the way up and the implications. That's sort of a template that I think, you probably can't go wrong with. Otherwise, I think it's going to be a little bit dependent on the round. One thing that is sometimes useful is to start out with a general frame or a general response, if applicable in the round, if it knocks out a lot of the material from the other side. So, sometimes there will be this big, I wish I had an example off the top of my head to make this a little bit clearer, but there will be this big, clarifying remark that you have at the start, or a reframe that you want to present, or you want to explain why their characterization was wrong. And then you can explain that knocks out their first claim, it knocks out their second claim on this, it knocks out their third claim on this. Just so you avoid kind of getting into repetitive rebuttal later on, where you're giving the same response to a number of things. And then you can transition into the more typical rebuttal and rebuilding. So that's one way of going about it. If that applies, so if there's a general response that responds to a bunch of stuff, could be useful to start with it. Let's see what else. 2 more things I'd say. One is you can start the theme by framing the importance of the theme, or you can end the theme by framing its importance. I don't actually think it matters all that much. What I'd say is if you have like a minute and a half of framing why the theme is important, maybe do it at the end, because it sounds a little bit weird to front load the importance of something you haven't proven yet so heavily. And then the only other thing I'd say is sometimes you can break up your theme into sort of steps that play into proving the theme. Well, let me see if there's any example I might have to illustrate that. You might have you might have an argument with a bunch of premises, or the theme that has a bunch of premises that are sort of building on each other. So maybe it's necessary to prove, take maybe the glorification of hard work as an example. Like maybe you need to prove at the start of your theme, like the debate about what the glorification of hard work actually looks like, in terms of whether it's applying to outcomes or to the process of hard work itself. Then secondly, and correspondingly, how are individuals actually responding to that? How does it make them feel? And then thirdly, the impact. So something like that. That was a poor example, I think. But the point is, you can also break up the theme into sub-themes, is what I'm trying to illustrate, or sub-questions that might allow you to build strategically upon what you're proving. So hopefully that's kind of like a few different ways you can go about it. But yeah, as you flagged in the question, it's definitely going to be round dependent.
Thank you.
Right. Do we have any more questions from the audience? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi. First, thank you, and second, sorry for opening my camera. I'm having a few troubles with that.
No problem.
And my question is more about asking you if you have any tips to give us about improving the skill of taking notes, but at the same time not missing what my partners are saying.
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that I found, and I think a lot of debaters find very difficult. For me, the thing that helped most is prepping more rebuttal, because I found, maybe this sidesteps your question in the sense that I'm not really saying take notes and listen at the same time. I'm saying take notes earlier on so that you can just listen later a little bit more. So the way that I did it is I would just prepare more rebuttal in prep, so that during the round, there was actually a little bit less that I needed to write. I found that super useful in actually being able to listen to what was going on in the round. But I also know a lot of debaters who basically just scribble a few notes on their page, don't really use many notes, and like to listen a lot more carefully. Never would have worked for me because my memory is not that good, and I couldn't have organized the speech in my head that effectively, but it does work for some people. Other than that, I think having a strong sense of when you need to listen and when you don't, I think can be useful. So this is where it's particularly useful to know what your teammates are like. So what does my second speaker say when they're about to say something important? Ideally, your second speaker is just really good at emphasizing things. And then you know when the second speaker thinks it's important to listen. And ideally, the same is true of your opponents. That's not always true, and then that can complicate things. But listening to the emphasis of the other speakers in the round can help guide you about when you really need to tune in, and the other moments where you think you can focus on writing more. But finally, if it's to the point where you're taking notes and you're trying to listen simultaneously, I think the best thing to do is just, if it's something that you really need to listen to, you might have to make your notes briefer. Like you might not be able to write out full sentences or even half sentences if you really want to be listening at the same time. And for me, if I was writing something unrelated to what the speaker was saying, I typically wouldn't trust myself to remember exactly what the speaker was saying at that moment, like a minute and a half later. So if the speaker's saying something that's important and I'm writing notes about something else, I'll take another sheet, just like scribble like 3-4 words just as a mental cue about what that speaker was saying at that moment that I then need to respond to, so that I won't forget to get back to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Sure. Aranza?
Yeah, thank you a lot for the tips. And my question is, how do you recommend us telling or letting the judge know that you win? So you tell him directly, or you put in your notes, or I don't know how to put it.
It's a good question. There is sort of an extent to which like saying to the judge, this wins the round, can be quite useful if done well, but it can also be quite annoying. So I understand the hesitation to do that. Yeah, I'd say, the minimum strategy is just to say, this is the most important theme in the round. If we prove it, we win for XYZ reasons. I honestly think that's fine. Like I don't think it's as stylistically annoying as some people might think. I don't find it stylistically annoying. Maybe some people will. The other way is just to be phenomenal at emphasizing things with importance, at indirectly amplifying the importance of an issue. But, you know, sort of the foolproof, you know, will never fail you way of doing it is just to say it, frankly.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Any more questions? I would also encourage, like, at this point, Matthew's not only a third speaker, but a very accomplished debater overall. If you are, like, some of you are very new to debate, some of you are starting in representing your national teams. If you have any questions generally as well, that would also be a very good opportunity now. Like debate career, debate tips, maybe the pressure of a world's final. Does anyone else have any questions? Yeah. Okay. Just for probably, I'll just read it out loud for the people on YouTube. So a question from Rico. Hey, first of all, thank you for all the tips, but do you have any tips on identifying which of your arguments are round winning?
Yeah. So this sort of follows indirectly from what I was saying before about the different ways of weighing an argument. For me, the way I would figure out which argument is round winning is a couple things. First of all, figuring out which of your arguments has the highest or most important impact. That's probably something you can determine from prep. Figuring out which is the most plausible. So, you know, you don't necessarily want to be striving for the largest impact, but the one you think is most likely to actually occur. And thirdly, the one that is most unique or exclusive to your side. So it can't be proven through it can't be accomplished through other means. And it's hard for the other side to say that this problem doesn't require your specific solution to solve. And I think finding the argument that kind of scores the highest on a combination of those three metrics is probably going to be the argument that ends up being round winning for your side. Otherwise, sometimes that requires a bit of adaptation during the round. So for example, one thing that's rare, but that can be really effective is maybe the other side will say this debate is fundamentally about X, right? They've explicitly stated what they think is the most important. And then if you can prove that you win on that metric, then you know you're kind of golden from that point on. But in terms of from the start, identifying which of your arguments are probably going to be the best ones and the ones you want to emphasize, I think it's mostly what I said before about striking the balance between those three factors and choosing the argument that scores the best on them.
I think we have time for one more question and then we'll probably wrap it up.
Sounds good.
Anyone else? Let me look at the live comments as well. Okay. Yeah, I think if no one else has a question, I'll ask something. What would you recommend people to do in rounds they as thirds clearly know they're losing, particularly against teams they might be intimidated by, or like when perhaps the round has been close in general, but if you're, for example, third up, the third prop speaker really like push through and make things for the other side. How do you respond? Do you think it's better to restructure for your side or to try and like do you think you battle up against the third or try to like go back to the basics of your case, etc.?
You kind of like halfway through that question, but was it just dealing with a round that you're losing in or like a really good speaker before you, that kind of thing? Is that right?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Well, it's not easy. I think it's at that point, this is what I'll say, it's at that point where everything about strategy, I think, becomes 10 times more important, because if you're speaking after a third speech that is exceptional, or you're speaking against a team that is exceptional, you're just not going to be able to do everything. And you're going to have to prioritize. Again, not only you're going to have to prioritize what you're speaking about during your speech, but also what you're thinking about in those 8 minutes before you. And there have been times where I've spoken right after some of the best speakers in the world, and I've just decided, like, there is no way I can deal with all of this. It is completely impossible. And it's at that point where you don't necessarily want to give up the strategy that your team had before. You don't want to give up the case. You still have to work with what you work with. You can't recreate a case from third, and you probably don't have a way of recreating it because you said what you had to say in prep. You came up with the ideas you had to come up with. But you want to try to hone in on, like, what is the path of least resistance to winning this round? What is the minimum thing I need to prove, and then go about proving it and trying to do it very efficiently. So there might be a ton of material dumped in the speech before you, and then you're probably going to have to group some of it. You're probably going to have to try to introduce a broad response that knocks out a bunch of claims that they have, because you're just not going to be able to deal with them all independently. So yeah, I think the gist is strategy becomes all the more important against people who are excellent debaters. And you really need to think about prioritizing your time accordingly if you're going to have a shot in the round. So I guess we're leaving it at that now. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Manuel. Thanks, Cesar. It's been great being here, chatting with you all. And I hope everything goes well at the tournament in a couple of weeks. Feel free to message me if there are any questions. You can find me on Facebook if there's anything that there wasn't time to get to, or about debate or tips in general. I'd be more than happy to respond.
Thank you so much for the workshop, and thank you to everyone who came. We'll be having a lot of this in the next few weeks, so we'd be very glad if you can also join. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. This was very, very useful.
Thanks.